Detective Sarah Chen sat in the prosecution gallery, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. The metallic taste of copper filled her mouth as she bit down on her tongue, a nervous habit she developed over 20 years of law enforcement. 3 years. 3 grueling, exhausting, soul-crushing years of chasing Marcus Delgado, the most ruthless jewelry thief in Colorado history. She'd sacrificed sleep, relationships, her own mental health, all for this moment. All for justice. Delgado had stolen nearly $2 million in diamonds, emeralds, rubies, and sapphires across the state. 12 different robberies. 12 different families destroyed. Sarah had interviewed countless victims, and their stories haunted her every waking moment. There was Mrs. Alina Patterson, an 84-year-old widow whose late husband had given her an exquisite diamond engagement ring in 1967. That ring was Alina's only physical connection to the man she'd loved for 53 years before he passed away. When Delgado's crew broke into her home, Alina watched from her bedroom closet as they ransacked her jewelry box. She'd had a heart attack the following week. She was still in physical therapy, still traumatized, still unable to sleep without medication. Then there was young mother Jennifer Hoffman, who'd been saving her great-grandmother's emerald brooch to pass down to her own daughter. That brooch represented 4 generations of women, a legacy of love and family history spanning over 100 years. When it vanished, so did Jennifer's sense of security. She'd installed 3 separate alarm systems in her home. She no longer left her house. Her therapist said she was developing severe anxiety disorder. Sarah had spent countless nights reviewing security footage, analyzing fingerprints, interviewing witnesses, building a case so meticulous and detailed that it should have been airtight. She'd worked 18-hour days. She'd missed her sister's wedding. She'd broken up with her boyfriend because she was never available, never present, always thinking about Delgado, always hunting him. And today was supposed to be the payoff. Today was supposed to be when the system worked, when justice prevailed, when Marcus Delgado received the punishment he deserved. But as Sarah sat in the courtroom gallery on this humid Tuesday afternoon in late June, watching the jury file back into the box after lunch, she felt something terrible settling into her chest. It was a feeling she recognized all too well, the feeling of a case crumbling, of evidence being systematically dismantled, of hope dying a slow and painful death. Delgado's defense attorney, a slick, expensive lawyer named Richard Carmichael from an elite Denver firm, had spent the last 3 days methodically destroying everything Sarah had built. He'd introduced reasonable doubt like poison gas seeping under doors and through cracks in walls. He'd questioned the chain of custody for physical evidence. He'd highlighted inconsistencies in witness statements. He'd brought in expert witnesses who contradicted Sarah's forensic evidence. And most devastatingly, he'd gotten 3 of Sarah's key witnesses to recant their testimonies. Sarah knew what had happened. Those witnesses had been threatened. She was certain of it. She'd seen the fear in their eyes when they took the stand, seen the way their hands trembled as they changed their stories under oath. But proving witness intimidation was nearly impossible. Delgado's criminal organization was sophisticated, careful, professional. They didn't leave obvious evidence of threats. They worked through subtle intimidation, a car following you home, an unknown person appearing at your child's school, a cryptic message left on your doorstep, just enough to terrify someone into silence. Sarah watched the jury as they settled into their seats. Their faces told her everything she needed to know. They looked unconvinced. They looked skeptical. They looked tired and confused by all the conflicting testimony and expert opinions. She could see it in the way they avoided eye contact with the prosecution table, in the way some of them glanced sympathetically toward the defense. These jurors had been poisoned by doubt, infected by reasonable uncertainty, seduced by the narrative of reasonable doubt that the defense had carefully constructed. Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, began her final instructions to the jury. "You must find the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt," she intoned solemnly. "If there is reasonable doubt, you must vote not guilty. The burden of proof rests entirely on the prosecution." Sarah's stomach twisted. Reasonable doubt. Those two words were destroying her case, destroying 3 years of work, destroying justice. Delgado had orchestrated these robberies. Sarah knew it with absolute certainty, but knowing something and proving it beyond reasonable doubt were two entirely different things. And then there was Delgado himself. He sat at the defense table wearing an expensive charcoal suit, his dark hair slicked back perfectly, his manicured nails gleaming under the courtroom lights. He looked calm, composed, confident. He looked like a successful businessman, not a career criminal. He looked like someone who was about to walk free, and he knew it. Throughout the trial, he'd smirked at Sarah multiple times. Once, he'd actually winked at her, a gesture so arrogant and offensive that Sarah had to physically restrain herself from lunging at him across the gallery. Marcus Delgado was 47 years old, and he'd been involved in organized crime since his early 20s. He'd served 2 previous sentences for robbery, but had somehow managed to avoid conviction for the most serious crimes. He had connections everywhere, in the police department, in city government, in the judicial system. He had money, resources, and a network of loyal criminals willing to do whatever he asked. And he had something else, something more dangerous than all of those things combined. He had absolute confidence in his own invincibility. Sarah thought about the victims again. She thought about Alina Patterson, whose trauma had aged her 10 years in just 3 years. She thought about Jennifer Hoffman, whose anxiety had progressed to the point where she could barely function. She thought about the other 10 victims whose stories were equally heartbreaking, equally devastating. These were good people. These were innocent people. And they deserved justice. They deserved to see the man who'd violated their homes and stolen their most precious possessions held accountable. But as the judge informed the jury that they would begin deliberations in the morning, Sarah felt tears of frustration burning behind her eyes. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and tell the jury that they were making a terrible mistake, that they were about to release a predator back onto the streets. But she couldn't. She had to sit silently, had to watch Delgado shake his lawyer's hand, had to witness the satisfaction radiating from his smug face. The courtroom began to empty. Reporters gathered their equipment and headed toward the exits, already composing their stories about the high-profile case that had captivated Denver for 3 years. The gallery spectators filed out, some shaking their heads in disappointment, others looking relieved that the trial was finally nearing its end. Sarah remained seated, unable to move, unable to process the devastating reality that justice might not prevail. Somewhere in the city in this moment, Marcus Delgado's associates were probably already planning their next robbery, already identifying their next target, already preparing to destroy more innocent lives. And there was nothing Sarah could do to stop them. This was the moment, the lowest moment, when everything would change forever. The courtroom door burst open with sudden violence, the sound echoing through the marble halls like a gunshot. Everyone froze instantaneously, as if time itself had paused. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The bailiff's hand moved toward his belt. Judge Patricia Morrison's gavel stopped mid-arc. Even Marcus Delgado's perpetual smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second, a microscopic crack in his armor that only Sarah noticed. Officer Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway lighting behind him. But it wasn't Webb who commanded everyone's attention. It was the creature beside him, a German shepherd of extraordinary presence and unmistakable nobility. The dog was massive, easily 90 pounds of pure muscle and intelligent determination. His coat was a rich black and tan, perfectly groomed and gleaming under the courtroom lights. But it was his eyes that truly captivated everyone in that room. They were amber-colored, penetrating, intelligent, the eyes of a creature who understood far more than most humans gave dogs credit for. Those eyes scanned the courtroom with methodical precision, processing information at speeds that human brains couldn't comprehend. Sarah's heart stopped. She hadn't requested this. Neither had the prosecution team. She'd submitted her closing arguments this morning, had rested the case on the evidence she'd so painstakingly collected. This was completely unexpected, utterly irregular, and potentially problematic from a legal standpoint. The defense attorney immediately jumped to his feet, his face flushing red with indignation. "Your Honor," Richard Carmichael bellowed, his voice dripping with outrage. "This is a complete violation of procedural rules. The prosecution has not disclosed any intention to present additional witnesses or evidence. This is prejudicial to my client. I move for an immediate mistrial." Judge Morrison's expression remained calm, but her sharp eyes tracked every movement. She'd presided over courtrooms for 32 years and had seen countless tricks and maneuvers. She wasn't easily rattled, but even she seemed momentarily taken aback by this unexpected development. She raised her hand, silencing Carmichael's continued protests. "Officer Webb," Judge Morrison said, her voice measured and authoritative, "I don't recall approving a K-9 demonstration at this stage of proceedings. We are well past the point of presenting new evidence or witnesses. The jury has heard closing arguments. They're about to begin deliberations. Please explain yourself." Officer Marcus Webb stepped into the courtroom fully, closing the door quietly behind him. He was a commanding presence himself, tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone who'd spent his entire adult life in law enforcement. His uniform was immaculate, every crease pressed to razor sharpness, every button polished to mirror brightness. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but more importantly, Webb carried himself with absolute confidence and professionalism. He wasn't here to cause problems. He was here because he believed he had something important to contribute. "Your Honor," Webb said, his voice calm and respectful, "I understand the court's concerns, and I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe this was crucial. I've been working with Detective Chen on this case for the past week. She has reasonable suspicions that certain evidence collected at the crime scenes might contain biological material that could be definitively linked to the defendant through K-9 identification. With your permission, I'd like to conduct a brief demonstration that would help the jury understand the reliability and accuracy of modern K-9 detection methods." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he continued, "King here has a 98% accuracy rate in scent identification. He's successfully identified suspects in 17 different cases over the past 2 years. His work has led to convictions, solved cold cases, and helped law enforcement agencies across the country. I believe his abilities could provide the jury with valuable perspective on the forensic evidence presented in this case." The defense attorney sputtered with indignation, launching into a lengthy objection about hearsay, about the unreliability of animal evidence, about the prejudicial nature of introducing a police dog at such a critical juncture. But Sarah could see something shifting in Judge Morrison's expression. The judge had a reputation for fairness, for considering evidence from all angles, for ensuring that justice was served even when it meant bending traditional procedures. Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, her eyes moving between Webb, the dog, and the defense attorney. The courtroom had become utterly silent. Even the court reporter's fingers had stilled over her keyboard. Everyone waited for the judge's decision. "Officer Webb," Judge Morrison said slowly, "you're asking me to allow evidence that is highly irregular and that the defense was given no opportunity to prepare for. That's a significant request." "I understand, Your Honor," Webb replied, "but I also believe that justice sometimes requires us to consider new information, even when it arrives unexpectedly. The accuracy of K-9 detection has been scientifically validated. The jury deserves to understand this method's reliability." Sarah's pulse had begun to race. She hadn't orchestrated this. She would have been shocked to learn that Webb had been investigating this possibility. But now that he was here, Now that this opportunity had materialized before her, she realized what he might be suggesting. If King could identify Delgado's scent on the evidence collected at the crime scenes, if the dog could provide independent verification of what Sarah had been arguing all along, then the defense's narrative of reasonable doubt might crumble. Judge Morrison drummed her fingers on the bench, a gesture of internal deliberation. The seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. The tension in the courtroom became almost unbearable. Delgado's smirk had completely disappeared now. Sarah could see him whispering urgently to his attorney, could see the sudden uncertainty in his dark eyes. Finally, Judge Morrison made her decision. "I'm going to allow this," she said, her voice firm and authoritative. "But Mr. Carmichael, you will have the opportunity to cross-examine Officer Webb regarding King's reliability and the methods used in this identification process. And Officer Webb, you will explain clearly and precisely what King is demonstrating and why it matters to this case. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," Webb said, relief evident in his voice. Carmichael began another round of objections, but Judge Morrison cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. "My decision is final, Counselor. Now, Officer Webb, if you would kindly proceed." Webb reached down and scratched behind King's ears, a gesture of reassurance and preparation. The dog's entire body seemed to shift, becoming even more alert, even more focused. Whatever was about to happen, King was ready. The German Shepherd had been trained for situations exactly like this, remaining calm under pressure, performing his duties regardless of the chaos surrounding him, maintaining his professional focus even in emotionally charged environments. As Webb began walking King slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom, explaining in clear, accessible language how K9 detection worked, Sarah felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. It was fragile and delicate, but it was there, a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, justice wasn't dead in this courtroom. Maybe, just maybe, the system could still work. Maybe there was still a chance to save this case, to protect the victims from Delgado's continued criminal enterprise, to ensure that the man who'd caused so much suffering would finally face real consequences. She watched King's movements, watched the dog's nose working the air, watched the extraordinary intelligence radiating from those amber eyes. And she thought to herself that sometimes salvation arrived in the most unexpected forms, in a police officer's quiet conviction, in a dog's extraordinary abilities, in the judicial system's willingness to consider evidence that fell outside normal parameters. The gallery was completely silent now, completely riveted. Reporters had stopped their fidgeting and note-taking. Spectators had leaned forward in their seats, mesmerized by the dog's presence and purpose. Even the court officers seemed transfixed by what was unfolding. Sarah had no idea what King was about to reveal. She had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would change absolutely everything about this case, about justice in this courtroom, and about her own understanding of how fate sometimes operates through the most surprising channels. King entered the courtroom like a silent warrior descending into battle. His massive black and tan frame moved with purposeful grace that seemed almost choreographed, each step deliberate and measured. The muscles rippling beneath his dense coat spoke of countless hours of training, conditioning, and preparation. This was not a pet. This was not a companion animal brought into a courtroom for novelty or entertainment. This was a highly specialized law enforcement tool, a living, breathing instrument of justice, whose capabilities transcended human limitations in ways that most people couldn't fully appreciate. Officer Webb walked slightly ahead of King, maintaining loose control on the leash. The relationship between handler and dog was evident in every interaction. There was trust there, mutual respect, an almost telepathic communication that came from years of working together in high-pressure situations. Webb delivered his explanation in a clear, measured voice designed for juror comprehension rather than legal precision. King is a German Shepherd with specialized training in scent detection, Webb explained, walking slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom. His nose contains approximately 300 million olfactory receptors, compared to approximately 6 million in human noses. More importantly, the part of King's brain dedicated to analyzing smells is approximately 40 times larger than the corresponding human brain area. What this means is that King can detect odors at concentrations nearly 100 million times lower than human capacity. He paused, allowing the jury to absorb this information. Some jurors were nodding, clearly impressed by the scientific explanation. Others looked skeptical, as if they doubted whether any animal could truly be that superior to human senses. When we present King with a scent sample, in this case, biological material collected at crime scenes, we're leveraging abilities that evolution spent millions of years developing. King can distinguish between thousands of different individual scents. He can identify a single human's unique scent profile among a crowd of hundreds. He can track that scent across miles of terrain, through water, across paved surfaces. His accuracy rate in identification is 98%, which is actually higher than many forensic laboratory techniques. The courtroom remained absolutely silent, every person completely focused on Webb's presentation. Even the stenographer had paused momentarily, seemingly mesmerized by the dog's presence and the implications of Webb's words. Sarah watched the jury's faces carefully, trying to gauge their receptiveness. Some faces showed clear interest and acceptance. Others remained guarded, skeptical, exactly the reaction she'd expected from people who'd been conditioned by the defense to question everything. But then something extraordinary happened. King's behavior suddenly shifted. The dog's entire body went rigid, as if he'd been transformed into a statue carved from living muscle and bone. His ears perked up with sudden, intense focus. His nose began twitching with increasing rapidity, processing scent particles at accelerated speed. His breathing quickened audibly, the sound of his inhalations becoming sharp and pronounced. The leash in Webb's hand suddenly went taut as King began pulling with surprising force, his massive body straining against the restraint. "Easy, boy," Webb commanded, his voice maintaining professional calm even as his eyes widened with surprise. "Easy, King. We're not finished with the demonstration yet." But King ignored his handler's words. The dog's focus had locked onto something completely unexpected and entirely unplanned. His amber eyes were fixed on the back of the courtroom, toward the gallery seating area where spectators observed the proceedings. The dog's whines became more urgent, more desperate, almost frantic. His entire body language screamed that he detected something significant, something that his training had programmed him to alert on, something that transcended the careful parameters of Webb's planned demonstration. Sarah felt her detective instincts suddenly activate, a sixth sense that she developed over 20 years of law enforcement kicking into overdrive. Something was happening here that wasn't supposed to happen. King wasn't responding to a scent sample Webb had provided. King was reacting to something in the courtroom itself, to some presence that only his extraordinary olfactory system could detect. Judge Morrison's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward on her bench, her entire demeanor shifting from cautious permission to absolute attention. "Officer Webb," she said, her voice taking on an edge of authority, "what is happening with your dog? This does not appear to be part of the planned demonstration." Webb's jaw clenched visibly as he fought to maintain control of King. The dog was now pulling with such intensity that Webb had to plant his feet firmly and use both hands on the leash. "Your Honor, I'm not entirely sure," he admitted, his professional composure beginning to crack. "King is alerting on something, but I don't have a scent sample prepared. His behavior indicates he's detected something significant, but—" He stopped mid-sentence, confused and clearly struggling to understand what was happening. The defense attorney immediately seized the moment, launching to his feet with renewed confidence. "Your Honor, this is exactly what I was concerned about," Carmichael bellowed, his voice dripping with vindication. "This dog is behaving erratically and unpredictably. His response cannot be controlled or explained. How can we possibly trust evidence from an animal whose behavior is completely uncontrollable? But Sarah wasn't listening to Carmichael's objections. Her mind was racing, analyzing, processing. She stood up slowly, her eyes tracking King's focus, following the dog's gaze toward the back of the courtroom. Something in that direction had triggered King's alert. Something or someone. Sarah's detective instincts screamed at her to look, to scan the gallery, to identify what King had detected. The dog's nose was still twitching frantically. His body remained rigid with tension. His whines were becoming increasingly desperate, as if he was trying to communicate something urgent and critical that his handler wasn't understanding. The courtroom had erupted into confused murmurs. Journalists were beginning to stand up, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Spectators were craning their necks, trying to determine what the dog was focused on. Judge Morrison raised her hand, calling for order, but her own eyes were now directed toward the back of the courtroom, clearly trying to identify what King had detected. King's behavior was unlike anything Webb had ever witnessed in their 7 years of partnership. The dog was usually so controlled, so focused, so perfectly trained that he responded to commands with almost robotic precision. But this was different. This was raw instinct, ancient programming, the voice of evolution itself overriding even the most rigorous training protocols. Sarah's hand gripped the edge of the prosecution table, her knuckles turning white with tension. She could feel something enormous was about to happen, something that would change the trajectory of this case entirely. The air in the courtroom had become electrified with possibility and uncertainty. Every person in that room could sense it, the feeling that they were witnessing something significant, something that transcended normal courtroom procedure, something that might alter the course of justice. Webb pulled harder on the leash, trying to redirect King's attention back toward the center of the courtroom, back toward the carefully orchestrated demonstration he'd planned. But King resisted with unprecedented determination. The dog's focus remained locked on the back gallery, his entire being concentrated on communicating whatever he detected to his handler and to everyone in the courtroom. And then Sarah understood. King hadn't detected an innocent scent. King had detected a scent he'd been trained to recognize, a scent associated with a suspect, a scent embedded in his olfactory memory from crime scene evidence and investigative files. King was doing exactly what he was trained to do. He was identifying a person whose scent matched his training database. The question was, who? Sarah's eyes finally swept across the back row of the gallery, scanning faces, analyzing features, trying to understand what King had already determined through his superior olfactory capabilities. And there, in the back corner, partially obscured by shadow, sat a woman wearing enormous sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low over her face. She held a small child, a precious 3-year-old girl with dark ringlets cascading down her back. But it was the woman's face that made Sarah's blood run absolutely cold. The woman's entire body was trembling. Her face had gone deathly pale, almost gray. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps that were audible even from where Sarah stood. She was sweating profusely despite the courtroom's climate-controlled temperature. And her eyes were locked on King with pure, undeniable terror. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew that face. She knew it from files and photographs and investigative reports. She knew it from a case that had gone cold 3 years ago, from a witness who disappeared before prosecution, from a puzzle piece that had been missing for so long that Sarah had almost stopped looking for it. But King hadn't forgotten. Every person in that courtroom felt it. The sudden, seismic shift in the air, the electric tension crackling like lightning before a violent thunderstorm. The atmosphere had fundamentally transformed from cautious curiosity into something darker, something more dangerous, something that carried the weight of imminent revelation. King was pulling backward now with such intensity that Officer Webb had to plant his feet firmly on the polished courtroom floor. his uniform straining with the effort of maintaining control. The leash was stretched taut, quivering with the pressure of the dog's determination. Whines escaped from King's throat, urgent, desperate whines that suggested the dog was attempting to communicate something absolutely critical to everyone around him. Officer Webb's face showed visible confusion mixed with professional recognition. This wasn't part of the carefully planned demonstration. This wasn't a controlled exercise designed to educate the jury about K9 detection capabilities. This was something entirely different, something spontaneous and uncontrolled and potentially problematic from a legal standpoint. Webb's eyes darted between King and Judge Morrison, silently asking for guidance while simultaneously trying to understand what his partner had detected. "Your Honor, I'm not entirely sure what's happening," Webb admitted, his professional composure beginning to fracture at the edges. "King is alerting on something, but I don't have a scent sample prepared for this part of the courtroom. His behavior indicates he's detected something significant, but—" The defense attorney seized the moment like a predatory shark sensing blood in the water. Richard Carmichael's face flushed with renewed confidence and vindication. He'd been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity to undermine the prosecution's credibility. "Your Honor, this is precisely what I was concerned about when the prosecution attempted this unprecedented courtroom stunt," Carmichael bellowed, his voice rising to theatrical levels. "This dog is behaving erratically and unpredictably. His response cannot be controlled or explained. How can we possibly trust evidence from an animal whose behavior is completely uncontrollable and whose reactions are completely arbitrary? This is exactly the kind of prejudicial circus that undermines the integrity of our judicial system." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, then continued with renewed aggression. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate mistrial based on the prosecution's manipulation of this courtroom and the introduction of unreliable, unpredictable evidence designed solely to prejudice the jury against my client." Judge Morrison raised her hand, silencing Carmichael's continued tirade, but her expression showed that she was genuinely concerned about the unexpected turn of events. She'd presided over courtrooms for 32 years, had seen countless tricks and maneuvers and legal strategies, but this situation fell outside her normal experience. A dog behaving unexpectedly during testimony was not something that law school had adequately prepared her for. But Sarah Chen wasn't listening to Carmichael's objections or Judge Morrison's concerns. Her mind was operating at a completely different level, processing information at the accelerated speed that came from years of detective work and investigative training. She stood up slowly, moving almost on instinct rather than conscious decision, her eyes tracking King's focus with laser-like intensity. She followed the dog's gaze toward the back of the courtroom, toward the gallery seating area where spectators observed the proceedings. Something in that direction had triggered King's alert. Some presence, some scent, some piece of evidence that only the dog's extraordinary olfactory system could detect. King's nose continued twitching frantically, processing scent particles at accelerated speed. His body remained rigid with tension, every muscle coiled like a spring wound impossibly tight. His whines were becoming increasingly desperate, increasingly urgent, as if he was attempting to communicate something absolutely critical that his handler wasn't understanding. The courtroom had erupted into confused murmurs and whispered conversations. The careful silence that had characterized the earlier proceedings had shattered completely. Journalists were beginning to stand up from their seats, their reporters' instincts activating as they sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding. Spectators were craning their necks in various directions, trying to determine what the dog was focused on, trying to understand the source of King's extraordinary reaction. Judge Morrison raised her gavel, prepared to call for order, but her own eyes were now directed toward the back of the courtroom. Even the judge, with her decades of judicial experience and her carefully cultivated composure, was being drawn into the mystery of what King had detected. Sarah's hand gripped the edge of the prosecution table so tightly that her knuckles turned white, the blood draining from her skin. She could feel something enormous building, something seismic, something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of this case and perhaps her entire career. The air in the courtroom had become electrified with possibility and uncertainty, charged with the potential energy of a revelation that was about to explode into the proceedings. King's behavior was unlike anything Webb had ever witnessed in their 7 years of partnership. The German Shepherd was usually so controlled, so focused, so perfectly trained that he responded to commands with almost robotic precision. But this was different. This was raw instinct, ancient programming, the voice of evolution itself overriding even the most rigorous training protocols. This was a dog operating at his truest level, following scent trails, identifying individuals, performing the function that thousands of years of selective breeding had engineered into his DNA. Webb pulled harder on the leash, attempting to redirect King's attention back toward the center of the courtroom, back toward the carefully orchestrated demonstration he'd planned. His voice became firmer, more commanding. "King, heel. King, come." But the dog resisted with unprecedented determination, a level of defiance that shocked even his handler. King's focus remained locked on the back gallery, his entire being concentrated on communicating whatever he detected to Webb and to everyone in the courtroom. And then, in that crystalline moment of understanding, Sarah's mind connected all the pieces of the puzzle. King hadn't detected a random, innocent scent. King had detected a scent he'd been trained to recognize, a scent associated with a suspect, a scent embedded in his olfactory memory from crime scene evidence and investigative files. King was doing exactly what he was trained to do. He was identifying a person whose scent matched his training database, a person whose biological material had been found at crime scenes, a person who was connected to the very crimes that had brought everyone to this courtroom. The question that burned in Sarah's mind was, who? Her eyes finally swept across the back row of the gallery, scanning faces with desperate intensity, analyzing features, trying to understand what King had already determined through his superior olfactory capabilities. The gallery was partially obscured by distance and shadow, but Sarah's detective vision had been honed by 20 years of identifying suspects, of reading faces, of recognizing guilt and fear in human expressions. And there, in the back corner, partially hidden in shadow cast by the courtroom's architectural features, sat a woman wearing enormous dark sunglasses that seemed designed to obscure her identity. A baseball cap was pulled low over her forehead, shadowing her features even further. She held a small child, a precious 3-year-old girl with dark ringlets cascading down her back, the child swinging her small legs innocently, completely unaware of the gathering storm. But it was the woman's face that made Sarah's blood run absolutely cold, that made her entire body go rigid, that made every hair on the back of her neck stand on end. The woman's entire body was trembling violently, her frame shaking with what appeared to be controlled terror. Her face had gone deathly pale, almost gray in color, as if all the blood had been drained from her skin. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps that were audible even from where Sarah stood at the prosecution table, even across the distance that separated the front of the courtroom from the back gallery. She was sweating profusely despite the courtroom's climate-controlled temperature and the cool air circulating from the sophisticated HVAC system. But most telling were her eyes. Her eyes were locked on King with pure, undeniable terror. Not confusion, not curiosity, terror. The kind of absolute, primal fear that comes from recognition, from the understanding that something long hidden was about to be exposed, that a chapter of her life that she'd thought was closed was about to be violently reopened. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat, felt her heart rate spike, felt the adrenaline flooding through her system like ice water. She knew that face. She knew it from investigative files and photographs and surveillance images. She knew it from a case that had gone cold 3 years ago, from a witness who disappeared before prosecution could move forward, from a puzzle piece that had been missing for so long that Sarah had almost stopped actively looking for it. But King hadn't forgotten. The dog's extraordinary olfactory memory, that 300 million receptor nose that could detect scents at concentrations nearly 100 million times lower than human capacity, had recognized her. The scent markers she'd left at crime scenes 3 years ago, the biological material that had been collected and cataloged and stored in evidence lockers, the unique signature of her individual chemistry that was as distinctive as a fingerprint. King had identified all of it. In that moment, Sarah understood the full implications of what was about to happen. In that moment, she realized that justice wasn't dead in this courtroom after all. In that moment, she recognized that sometimes salvation arrived in the most unexpected forms, wrapped in fur and loyalty, guided by instinct older than civilization itself. The little girl, completely oblivious to the mounting tension that was suffocating the courtroom like an invisible fog, became utterly enchanted with King. Her name was Emma, and she'd never seen anything quite like the magnificent German Shepherd before. At 3 years old, Emma's world was still fundamentally simple, a place where large dogs were sources of pure joy and wonder, where fear and danger were concepts too abstract for her developing mind to fully comprehend. She knew nothing of crime scenes or evidence or the weight of justice. She knew nothing of her mother's secrets or the reason they'd come to this serious, adult place filled with people in formal clothing and stern expressions. Emma had spent the morning coloring in her mother's lap, drawing pictures of flowers and stick figures while the adults around her engaged in incomprehensible dialogue about legal procedures and evidence presentation. She'd been quietly obedient, as her mother had coached her to be, sitting still and making minimal noise. But the sudden appearance of this magnificent creature, this large, beautiful dog with intelligent eyes and powerful muscles rippling beneath its coat, had completely captured her 3-year-old attention. While her mother, Michelle, desperately tried pulling Emma back down onto the wooden bench seat, the little girl resisted with the stubborn determination that only young children could muster. Michelle's hands gripped Emma's small waist, attempting to physically force her daughter back into a sitting position. "Emma, sit down," she hissed urgently, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sit down, sweetie. Stay still." But Emma had already caught King's scent, that distinctive canine smell of loyalty and companionship, and something indefinably wild and free. The dog's presence had awakened something primal in the little girl, something that transcended her mother's instructions or her awareness of social propriety. She wanted to touch the dog. She wanted to experience this magnificent creature that seemed to glow with an almost magical quality in her innocent perception. Emma stood up on the wooden bench seat, her small shoes making soft thuds against the aged oak. She extended one tiny arm, her finger pointing directly at the German Shepherd with the pure, unself-conscious innocence that only a young child could possess. Her movement was neither aggressive nor calculated. It was simply the unfiltered expression of a child's wonder and joy at encountering something beautiful. "Big doggy, big doggy," Emma squealed with unbridled joy, her voice high and crystalline and impossibly loud in the absolute silence that had fallen over the courtroom. So pretty, look at you, so big and pretty." Her childish enthusiasm echoed off the marble walls and wood paneling of the courtroom, amplifying the sound of her innocent delight. Her words seemed to reverberate through the space like the ringing of a bell that couldn't be unrung, that couldn't be taken back, that would fundamentally change the trajectory of everything that followed. Time seemed to stop. The world seemed to pause. In that single crystalline moment, a moment that would later be described as the turning point of the entire case, something extraordinary happened. Every single person in that courtroom turned simultaneously toward the back row. The judge leaned forward on her bench, her eyes widening. The jury members swiveled in their seats. The court reporters stopped their note-taking. The bailiffs turned their attention toward the gallery. The defense attorney halted his legal arguments mid-sentence. Even Marcus Delgado, sitting smugly at the defendant's table, turned to see what had captured everyone's attention. All eyes converged on little Emma and the woman sitting beside her. The woman's name was Michelle Torres, though Sarah Chen wouldn't fully confirm her identity until several moments later. But in that instant, as every eye in the courtroom locked onto her position, Michelle's face underwent a transformation so dramatic that it was almost painful to witness. The color that had been absent from her complexion drained away even further, becoming almost translucent, almost ghostly. She looked as if she might collapse from shock, as if the weight of her discovered identity was physically crushing her. Her hands, which had been trembling slightly, now shook with visible intensity. She gripped the wooden bench so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her fingernails bending backward against the pressure. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, almost hyperventilation, her chest rising and falling in quick, panicked movements. Sweat appeared on her forehead, on her upper lip, on the exposed skin of her neck. Her eyes were wide, reflecting absolute terror, the kind of primal fear that comes from understanding that your carefully constructed world has just collapsed, that your secrets have been exposed, that there is nowhere left to hide. Michelle's lips moved silently, forming words that made no sound. Sarah could read the shapes her mouth formed. No, 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 please, not like this. Emma, still standing on the bench with her small arm extended, continued her innocent adulation of King. She had no understanding of the seismic shift that had just occurred in the emotional and psychological atmosphere of the courtroom. To her, this was simply a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy, the moment when she'd pointed at something beautiful and everyone had turned to look. But for everyone else in that courtroom, Emma's innocent gesture had become the catalyst for absolute revelation. Officer Webb's expression hardened as understanding dawned on his face. He'd never met Michelle Torres personally, but he knew the case file. Every officer in the Denver Police Department knew about the woman who'd vanished 3 years ago, the inside accomplice to a series of jewelry store robberies, the woman who'd provided security codes and employee schedules to Marcus Delgado's criminal organization. Webb's jaw clenched visibly. He looked at King, then at Michelle, then at the small child standing innocently on the bench. Sarah felt something catch in her throat. She gasped audibly, the sound escaping involuntarily. Her hand moved to her mouth, her eyes widening with the full weight of realization. All the pieces of the puzzle were suddenly aligning. All the cold case files and missing person reports and investigative dead ends were suddenly converging on this single moment. "That's Michelle Torres," Sarah whispered, the words barely audible. But in the absolute silence of the courtroom, even her whispered words seemed to carry the weight of thunder. Judge Morrison's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something darker, the look of someone who just witnessed an extraordinary revelation unfold before her eyes in real time. She stood up slowly, her judicial composure maintaining even as her eyes reflected the shock of what was happening. "Officer Webb," Judge Morrison said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of intensity, "is it possible that King has identified someone connected to previous crimes? Is it possible that the scent he's alerting on matches biological material from other cases?" Webb nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on Michelle's terrified face. "Yes, Your Honor. King was trained on scent samples from multiple crime scenes. It's possible he's identified someone whose scent matches evidence from those previous cases." The implications hung in the air like a physical presence. Michelle stood up on trembling legs, Emma crying and confused by her mother's sudden panic and the way adults were staring at them. The little girl's voice rose in pitch, reflecting her growing distress. "Mommy, Mommy, why everyone looking? Mommy." Emma's innocent questions seemed to pierce through Michelle's protective barriers like arrows. Michelle's face crumpled. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, her entire body racking with sobs that seemed to originate from somewhere deep within her soul. She looked at her daughter, at this beautiful, innocent child who'd done nothing wrong, who'd simply pointed at a dog with childlike wonder, and her expression transformed into something broken and defeated. "No, no, no," Michelle whimpered, her voice breaking. "Please, not like this, not with my daughter watching. Please, God, not like this." But there was nowhere to run. There was no escape route. There was no way to undo the moment that had just occurred. King's alert was the evidence. Emma's innocent pointing was the testimony. And Michelle Tor's terror-stricken face was an unspoken confession that said everything words could not express. "That's Michelle Tor's," Sarah whispered, the realization hitting her like a thunderbolt of recognition that traveled through her entire nervous system. The name seemed to vibrate in the air, carrying with it the weight of 3 years of investigation, 3 years of dead ends, 3 years of a cold case that had grown colder with each passing month. Michelle Tor's, a name from investigative files that Sarah had memorized, studied, and obsessed over during countless sleepless nights. A woman who'd vanished without a trace after being questioned in connection with the jewelry heists, the very same crimes that Marcus Delgado had orchestrated from the shadows. A woman who'd been Delgado's inside partner, his accomplice, his essential link in the chain of criminal activity that had devastated so many families. Michelle had provided the intelligence that had made the robberies possible. She'd worked in the security industry, had access to alarm codes and security protocols. She'd cultivated relationships with employees at various jewelry stores, extracting information about security procedures, delivery schedules, and high-value inventory locations. She'd been the invisible hand operating behind the scenes, the facilitator who'd made it possible for Delgado's crew to strike with devastating precision and efficiency. And then, 3 years ago, when the investigation had begun closing in, when law enforcement started asking questions and building cases, Michelle had disappeared. Sarah had assumed she'd fled the state. She'd imagined Michelle living somewhere far away, California perhaps, or Arizona, or maybe even Mexico. Sarah had filed missing person reports and circulated photographs to law enforcement agencies across the country. She'd even privately wondered if Michelle had been killed by Delgado to prevent her from testifying against him. But Michelle hadn't died. Michelle hadn't fled to another state. Michelle had simply vanished into the shadows of everyday life, hiding in plain sight, raising a daughter, waiting for the investigation to cool and the danger to pass. And then King had found her. The German Shepherd's extraordinary olfactory memory, that incredible 300 million receptor nose, had recognized her. The scent markers she'd left at crime scenes 3 years ago, the biological material that had been collected from evidence at multiple robbery locations, the unique chemical signature of her individual body chemistry that was as distinctive as a fingerprint and impossible to replicate or disguise. King had identified all of it in an instant. Officer Webb's expression hardened as understanding dawned on his face like a sunrise that transformed the landscape from darkness into illumination. He'd never met Michelle Torres personally. She'd vanished before his time with the K-9 unit had begun. But he knew the case file intimately. Every officer in the Denver Police Department knew about the woman who disappeared 3 years ago, the inside accomplice to the jewelry heist series, the woman who'd provided critical information to a major criminal organization. Her disappearance had been one of those frustrating cases that detectives discussed in break rooms and over coffee, cases that seemed to mock the justice system's inability to close its most critical investigations. Webb's jaw clenched visibly as the implications crashed into his consciousness. He looked at King, confirming what the dog had already communicated through his extraordinary senses. Then he looked at Michelle, his expression hardening into something professionally detached but internally seething. His hand moved instinctively toward his radio, toward the communication system that would allow him to request backup and coordinate a response to this unexpected development. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming relief and vindication. She'd been so close to losing this case, so close to watching a dangerous predator walk free, so close to accepting defeat. But in this single moment, everything had changed. The universe had conspired to deliver justice in a way that no amount of investigative work or legal strategy could have engineered. Judge Morrison's expression shifted dramatically as understanding dawned. Her judicial composure, carefully cultivated over 32 years of presiding over courtrooms and managing difficult legal situations, began to crack at the edges. She stood up slowly, her black robes rustling with the movement. Her eyes reflected the shock and extraordinary nature of what was unfolding before her. "Officer Webb," Judge Morrison said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of intensity and purpose, "is it possible that King has identified someone connected to previous crimes? Is it possible that the scent he's alerting on matches biological material from other cases? From cases other than the one we're currently trying?" Webb nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on Michelle's terrified face. His hand remained near his radio, ready to activate it at any moment. "Yes, Your Honor," Webb confirmed, his voice taking on the formal tone of official testimony. King was trained on scent samples from multiple crime scenes, samples collected over the course of a 3-year investigation into a series of jewelry store robberies. The scent he's alerting on now matches biological material we recovered from those crime scenes. It's possible he's identified someone whose scent signature is directly connected to those previous crimes. The implications of his words seemed to hang in the courtroom like a physical presence, like a fog that was settling over everyone in the room, transforming understanding and shifting reality. Michelle Torres stood up on trembling legs, her movement ungainly and uncoordinated, as if her body was being controlled by someone else, as if her conscious mind had been disconnected from her physical form. Emma began crying, confused and frightened by her mother's sudden panic, and the way all the adults in the courtroom were suddenly staring at them with intense, focused attention. "Mommy, Mommy, why everyone looking?" Emma's innocent questions cut through the tension like a knife through silk, piercing directly into the core of human emotion. "Mommy, I scared. Why everyone looking?" Emma's small voice seemed to break something inside Michelle, some final barrier that had been holding her together, some last defense against the overwhelming reality of her exposure. The little girl didn't understand what was happening. She only knew that her mother was frightened, that something was wrong, that the safe world she'd inhabited was suddenly becoming dangerous and unpredictable. Michelle's face crumpled completely, as if an invisible hand had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart. Tears began streaming down her cheeks in torrents, her entire body racking with sobs that seemed to originate from somewhere deep within her soul, from the place where hope goes to die, where dreams are shattered, where consequences finally come due. She looked at her daughter, at this beautiful, innocent child who'd been born after her crimes, who'd done nothing wrong, who'd simply pointed at a dog with childlike wonder and inadvertently destroyed her mother's carefully constructed facade. And her expression transformed into something absolutely broken and defeated, something that spoke to the terrible realization that she'd brought this moment upon herself through her own choices and actions. "No, no, no," Michelle whimpered, her voice breaking into fragments like a mirror struck by violence. "Please, not like this. Not with my daughter watching. Please, God, not like this." But there was no escape. There was no magic incantation that could undo what had just occurred. There was no rewind button on reality, no way to erase the moment that had just transformed from private shame into public revelation. King's alert was evidence that couldn't be disputed. Emma's innocent pointing was testimony that couldn't be contradicted. And Michelle Torres' terror-stricken face was an unspoken confession that said everything words could not express. Officer Webb began speaking into his radio, his voice calm and professional despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Dispatch, this is K9 Unit 1. We have a suspect in custody at the downtown courthouse. Gallery B requests uniformed officers for transport and processing. Suspect is Michelle Torres, wanted in connection with multiple felony cases from 2023. Also have one child present who will require social services contact. The courtroom erupted. Officers who'd been stationed throughout the building immediately moved toward the gallery with practiced precision. Their movements were coordinated and efficient, the result of training and procedure. Within moments, uniformed police officers surrounded Michelle and Emma, blocking all potential escape routes. Sarah stood up, her own legs feeling unsteady, her own breathing shallow and rapid. She gripped the prosecution table for support, needing the physical anchor to prevent herself from collapsing. 3 years. 3 years of investigation and dead ends and frustration had just been resolved in less than 5 minutes by a dog's extraordinary sense of smell and a little girl's innocent gesture. Judge Morrison called for order, her gavel striking the bench repeatedly, though the courtroom was already beginning to settle into a stunned silence. The magnitude of what had just occurred was only beginning to register in everyone's minds. Michelle didn't resist as the officers placed handcuffs on her wrists. She didn't fight or attempt escape or protest her innocence. She simply collapsed into herself, her body seeming to shrink, her spirit seeming to wither. She looked at Emma one final time, her eyes streaming with tears, her expression reflecting the full weight of her consequences. Emma screamed for her mother as social workers gently but firmly separated them. "Mommy, Mommy, where you going? I want Mommy." Her childish cries echoed through the courtroom, a sound that would haunt everyone present for years to come. As officers handcuffed Michelle Torres, the courtroom erupted into controlled chaos that seemed to defy the laws of physics and probability. The carefully maintained silence and decorum that had characterized the proceedings suddenly shattered like glass struck by a hammer. Reporters leaped to their feet simultaneously, their journalistic instincts activating with primal intensity. Cameras flashed in rapid succession, creating a strobe light effect that illuminated the gallery in bursts of brilliant white light. Journalists shouted questions over one another, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of competing demands for information and confirmation. "Is that Michelle Torres?" one reporter screamed across the courtroom. "How did police locate her?" another demanded. "Is she connected to the Delgado case?" a third voice called out. But the most devastating sound in that moment was Emma's voice. The little girl screamed for her mother with the raw, primal desperation that only a 3-year-old child could express when separated from the only parent she'd ever known. Her cries pierced through every other sound in the courtroom like daggers, cutting through the professional detachment of law enforcement officers and the clinical objectivity of legal professionals. "Mommy, Mommy, where you going?" Emma's tiny voice rose to an almost unbearable pitch, her small body struggling against the gentle but firm restraint of the social worker who'd been assigned to separate her from her mother. "I want Mommy. Mommy, where you going? Mommy, come back." The social worker, a woman named Catherine Martinez who'd been working in child protective services for 15 years, spoke in soft, soothing tones designed to calm the terrified child. "It's okay, sweetie. It's okay. We're going to take care of you. You're going to be safe. Everything is going to be okay." But Catherine's words, though kindly intentioned, seemed to fall on deaf ears. Emma's world had just fractured into pieces. The woman who'd been her entire universe, her source of food, comfort, safety, and unconditional love, was being taken away by people in uniforms. In Emma's 3-year-old mind, there was no framework for understanding why this was happening, no cognitive structure that could process the adult complexities of criminal justice and legal consequences. Michelle, as the officers guided her toward the exit, turned her head to look back at her daughter one final time. Her face was a mask of anguish and devastation, her eyes filled with tears that seemed to flow from an inexhaustible well of maternal heartbreak. She didn't resist as the officers moved her forward. She didn't fight or protest or attempt to reclaim her daughter. She simply allowed herself to be led away, her shoulders slumped in defeat, her body moving with the mechanical precision of someone whose spirit had been completely broken. "I'm sorry, Emma," Michelle whispered, her voice barely audible above the chaos. "Mommy's so sorry. Mommy loves you so much. I'm so sorry." Officer Webb knelt beside King and scratched behind the dog's ears, his movements deliberate and gentle despite the extraordinary circumstances unfolding around them. The German shepherd's behavior had returned to baseline, his alerting complete, his job finished, his extraordinary senses no longer detecting the scent that had triggered his initial response. "Good boy, King. Very good boy," Webb murmured, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and something that sounded almost like awe. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You're a good boy." King's tail wagged slowly, the dog seemingly oblivious to the magnitude of what he'd just accomplished. For King, there was no understanding of the implications of his actions. There was no comprehension of the case he'd just cracked open, the fugitive he'd identified, the justice system's gears he'd set in motion. King simply knew that he'd done what he'd been trained to do, that his handler was pleased with his performance, and that perhaps a treat or praise might be forthcoming. But what King had done was far more extraordinary than anyone in that courtroom initially realized. His alert on Michelle hadn't simply identified a missing person. It had connected Michelle directly to Marcus Delgado's crimes. She was facing prosecution for 3-year-old felonies, multiple counts of burglary, theft, conspiracy, and organized crime involvement. She would face interrogation by professional investigators. She would be confronted with evidence of her involvement. And faced with significant prison time, potentially 10 to 15 years, she would almost certainly cooperate with prosecutors and testify against her former partner in exchange for a reduced sentence. King had just handed Sarah Chen the missing piece of her puzzle. The dog had provided the connection that would allow prosecutors to transform circumstantial evidence into irrefutable proof. The dog had created the pathway that would finally allow justice to prevail. Judge Morrison was already conferring with court officers, her expression reflecting the extraordinary nature of this development. She called for a brief recess, allowing the courtroom to process what had just occurred. The gallery was erupting in conversations, with spectators discussing the shocking turn of events, with journalists comparing notes and preparing stories that would dominate news cycles for weeks to come. Sarah remained standing at the prosecution table, her hands gripping the wooden surface for support. She felt as if she were floating, as if her body had become somehow disconnected from reality. 3 years of investigation and dead ends and frustration had just been resolved in less than 5 minutes. 3 years of believing that justice might never prevail had just been transformed into certainty that it would. She looked at King, at this magnificent German shepherd who seemed completely unaware of his own heroism. The dog had no concept of the lives he'd just changed, the justice he'd just delivered, the course of legal history he'd just altered. He was simply a dog, operating according to his nature, following his training, responding to the extraordinary capabilities that evolution had engineered into his species over thousands of years. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, though she knew the dog couldn't possibly understand her words. "Thank you so much." The implications of what had just occurred were beginning to ripple through the entire case. Delgado's smugness had been completely replaced by absolute shock and dawning panic. His attorney was conferring with him urgently, his earlier confidence evaporating like water on a hot surface. The defense strategy that had been so carefully constructed was suddenly obsolete, rendered meaningless by a development that no one could have anticipated or prepared for. The jury members were sitting in stunned silence, processing what they'd witnessed. Some were nodding to one another, their faces reflecting the understanding that the case had just fundamentally changed. Others looked troubled, seemingly wrestling with the implications of what they'd just observed. But all of them seemed to understand that something momentous had just occurred, that the trial they'd been participating in had just taken a turn toward a conclusion that suddenly seemed obvious and inevitable. Catherine Martinez, the social worker, was on her phone, coordinating with her department to arrange temporary placement for Emma. The little girl had stopped screaming, had collapsed into a state of shock and trauma, her small body limp and unresponsive. Catherine spoke softly to her, explaining in the simplest possible terms that she was going to stay with some nice people who would take care of her, that everything would be okay, that this was all going to work out. But even as Catherine spoke these reassurances, she knew that nothing would ever be completely okay for Emma again. The little girl's world had been shattered. Her sense of safety and security had been destroyed. She would carry the trauma of this moment for the rest of her life. The memory of being separated from her mother in a public courtroom, the confusion and terror, the abandonment that her 3-year-old mind would struggle to comprehend. The human cost of justice was becoming visible in real time. Justice was being served. Yes, Marcus Delgado would finally face real consequences. Michelle Torres would finally face prosecution. The victims would finally receive closure. But the price of that justice was being paid by an innocent child who'd done nothing wrong except be born to a woman who'd made terrible choices. Sarah felt the weight of that realization pressing down on her like a physical force. Justice and compassion were not always the same thing. Justice could be served while simultaneously breaking an innocent heart. Justice could prevail while simultaneously creating new victims, collateral damage in the war against crime. But as Sarah looked at the victims sitting in the gallery, Mrs. Alina Patterson holding her recovered diamond ring, Jennifer Hoffman touching the emerald brooch that had been returned to her, the other victims whose stolen treasures had been recovered, she understood that the price Emma was paying, though devastating, was necessary. The alternative was allowing a predator to remain free, allowing crimes to go unpunished, allowing the guilty to escape justice while the innocent suffered. Officer Webb stood up, his hand still resting on King's head. He met Sarah's eyes across the courtroom, and in that moment, an understanding passed between them. They both knew what King had done. They both understood the magnitude of his contribution to justice, and they both recognized the bittersweet nature of a victory that came at such a human cost. 6 weeks later, the Denver courthouse was filled with an atmosphere of quiet resolution and hard-won justice. Marcus Delgado stood before Judge Patricia Morrison as the verdict was being read aloud, his face a grotesque mask of shock and disbelief. The jury had deliberated for only 3 days, a remarkably quick decision given the complexity of the case and the volume of evidence that had been presented. But Michelle Torres' testimony had been absolutely devastating to the defense. Under oath, with full knowledge that she was facing 7 years in prison regardless, Michelle had methodically detailed every aspect of her criminal partnership with Delgado. She described how she'd provided him with security codes obtained through her work in the security industry. She'd explained how she'd cultivated relationships with jewelry store employees to extract information about high-value inventory and security procedures. She detailed the specific robberies, the planning, the execution, the distribution of stolen merchandise to fences and criminal networks. She'd painted a picture of a sophisticated, calculated criminal enterprise orchestrated by a man who viewed other human beings as nothing more than obstacles to be overcome or resources to be exploited. The jury found Delgado guilty on all 18 counts: organized crime, multiple counts of robbery, conspiracy, money laundering, and crime connected to organized crime enterprises. The maximum sentence for such crimes was 35 years in federal prison. Judge Morrison sentenced him to 33 years, a sentence that essentially ensured he would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. Marcus Delgado, Judge Morrison intoned, her voice carrying the weight of justice finally served, you have been found guilty of crimes that devastated the lives of innocent people. You have shown no remorse, no recognition of the harm you've caused, no indication that you possess the capacity for human compassion. This court sentences you to 33 years in federal prison. May you use this time to contemplate the consequences of your actions. Delgado's face had gone absolutely white. His carefully constructed facade of invincibility had crumbled completely. He'd been so certain that he would walk free, so confident in his power and connections and ability to manipulate the system. But King's alert and Michelle's testimony had destroyed every defense strategy he'd constructed. The three elderly women whose stolen heirlooms had been recovered attended the sentencing hearing together, sitting in the front row of the gallery. Mrs. Alina Patterson held her recovered diamond engagement ring in her trembling hand, the ring that represented 53 years of marriage to a man she'd loved more than life itself. Jennifer Hoffman stood beside her, wearing her recovered emerald brooch over her heart, tears streaming down her face. The other 10 victims of Delgado's robberies sat nearby, their collective presence a testament to the reaches of his criminal enterprise and the lives he'd destroyed. When Judge Morrison announced the sentence, Alina Patterson began to weep openly, not tears of sadness, but tears of relief and validation. Jennifer Hoffman stood up and actually applauded, her gesture of celebration prompting others in the gallery to join in, until the entire courtroom was filled with the sound of justice finally prevailing. Sarah Chen stood outside the courthouse on a brilliant June afternoon, the Colorado sun warm on her face, the sky impossibly blue. Officer Marcus Webb stood beside her, with King sitting perfectly obediently at his side. Photographers surrounded them, capturing images that would be published in newspapers across the country. News outlets from Los Angeles to New York had picked up the story. Police dog solves 3-year-old cold case when toddler points. The story had become something of a media sensation. Every news outlet wanted to feature King, wanted to highlight the remarkable nature of the K-9 unit's capabilities, wanted to celebrate the extraordinary circumstances that had led to justice. Late-night talk show hosts had made jokes about it. Morning news programs had interviewed Webb extensively about his partnership with King and the dog's extraordinary abilities. The story had captured the public imagination in a way that few criminal cases ever did, because it featured an innocent child, a remarkable dog, and the ultimate triumph of justice against seemingly insurmountable odds. King is a hero, one journalist called out from the crowd of reporters surrounding them. How does it feel to have worked with such an extraordinary animal? Webb smiled, scratching behind King's ears. The German shepherd's tail wagged steadily, completely unbothered by the cameras and attention. King is special, Webb said, his voice filled with genuine affection and respect. He did what he was trained to do, and he did it perfectly. But I think what people don't always understand is that dogs like King aren't heroes in the way humans conceive of heroism. King doesn't understand good and evil. He doesn't comprehend justice or morality. He simply followed his training and his extraordinary senses. His accuracy and reliability are what make him invaluable to law enforcement. Sarah stepped forward, her own emotions carefully controlled but her eyes reflecting the profound gratitude she felt. What I want to emphasize is that this case represents the intersection of exceptional law enforcement work, extraordinary animal capabilities, and the kind of random chance that sometimes determines how justice unfolds. Without Officer Webb's decision to bring King into this courtroom, without that little girl's innocent pointing, this case might never have been solved. Detective work, investigation, and evidence collection are crucial, but sometimes justice also requires a measure of serendipity. She paused, then continued, her voice becoming slightly quieter and more reflective. There's one aspect of this case that I think is important to acknowledge, and that's the human cost. There's a 3-year-old child, Emma Torres, who has lost her mother. She didn't commit any crime. She didn't choose her mother's path, but she's now living with her grandmother, processing the trauma of losing her parent to the criminal justice system. Justice has been served in this case, but not without collateral damage. Not without innocent people suffering consequences for crimes they didn't commit. The courtroom had been transformed into a venue for ongoing legal proceedings related to Emma's custody and Michelle's sentencing. Michelle had pleaded guilty to charges stemming from her involvement in the jewelry heists and had received 7 years in federal prison, a reduced sentence from what she might have faced had she not cooperated with prosecutors. But 7 years would mean Emma would be 10 years old before her mother was released from prison. Emma's grandmother, Rosa Torres, had been awarded temporary custody immediately after Michelle's arrest. Rosa was a kind, loving woman in her 70s who'd raised 3 daughters of her own and was now devoting herself to providing Emma with stability and healing. Social workers and child psychologists were working with Emma to help her process the trauma of her mother's arrest and the sudden disruption of her life. Emma had undergone evaluation and counseling. The psychologists who'd assessed her indicated that she would likely require years of therapy to work through the trauma of being separated from her mother in such a public and dramatic way. But they also noted that, with proper support and the loving care of her grandmother, there was good reason to believe that Emma would develop into a healthy, well-adjusted person who could overcome this devastating experience. Sarah knelt down and wrapped her arms around King, burying her face in his thick fur. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks, tears of relief, gratitude, and complex emotions that she couldn't quite articulate. The dog's massive frame was solid and warm beneath her embrace. His tail continued wagging, his body language communicating absolute acceptance and affection. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her words intended only for King and Officer Webb. "Thank you for being extraordinary. Thank you for changing everything." King licked her face, his amber eyes gentle and kind. He had no understanding of what his actions had accomplished. He had no comprehension of the lives he'd changed, the justice he'd delivered, the course of legal and personal history he'd altered. He'd simply done what his nature and training had prepared him to do, recognized a scent, alerted his handler, and performed his function with perfect accuracy. Officer Webb placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and understanding. "Sometimes the greatest gifts we can give the world don't require understanding on our part," he said quietly. "King doesn't know he's a hero. He just knows he did what he was trained to do, and somehow that's even more beautiful than conscious heroism. It's instinct, loyalty, and dedication in their purest forms." 3 weeks later, Emma Torres sat in her grandmother's living room in Boulder, Colorado. Rosa was reading her a children's book about a brave princess who'd overcome great obstacles. Emma listened intently, her 3-year-old mind slowly healing from the trauma she'd experienced. She no longer asked for her mother every moment of every day. The acute panic of separation had slowly transformed into something more manageable, a kind of persistent sadness that would take time and love to fully process. Rosa had started taking Emma to therapy sessions once a week. The child psychologist, Dr. Amanda Chen, was using play therapy to help Emma express her feelings and begin to process her experiences. Slowly, Emma was learning that she wasn't responsible for her mother's choices, that separation wasn't her fault, that she could still love her mother while understanding that her mother had done things that had consequences. News outlets continued to cover the Delgado case and its extraordinary resolution. Crime documentaries began developing episodes about King and his remarkable abilities. Officer Webb was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences across the country about K-9 unit integration and scent detection capabilities. King became something of a celebrity in Denver, recognized on streets, featured in photo opportunities with community members. But for Officer Webb and King, life returned to its normal rhythms. They continued their daily patrols, continued responding to calls, continued working to protect their community. King remained focused on his job, unbothered by his sudden fame. He went to work each day with the same dedication and professionalism that had characterized his entire career. Sarah Chen was promoted to senior detective, a position she'd been working toward for years. Her investigative work on the Delgado case, despite the final resolution coming from an unexpected source, had demonstrated her exceptional abilities and dedication. She continued working on cold cases, continued hunting for justice on behalf of victims and their families. And somewhere in Denver, in a federal prison facility in the Colorado mountains, Marcus Delgado spent his days in a small cell, contemplating the extraordinary circumstances that had brought him to this place. He had decades of incarceration ahead of him, decades to think about the young child who'd pointed at a dog, the German shepherd whose senses had betrayed him, the justice system that had finally caught up with him despite all his efforts to evade it. Sometimes justice arrived in conventional ways, through careful investigation, meticulous evidence collection, systematic legal procedure. But sometimes justice arrived in the most unexpected forms, through a dog's extraordinary senses and a child's innocent pointing toward something beautiful. Sometimes the most powerful testimony came not from words, but from the intersection of animal instinct and human chance.